Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight, whenever you happen to be seeing this, I actually want to do a book review. And I've read this book in its totality. We won't talk about how many years ago it's been, because it's been a minute. And that is The Tree of Life, an illustrated study in magic by Israel Regardie. I did a full video set on Israel Regardie, how he got into it and his life and stuff like that. I think it was 2 videos that I made on him. And it's edited and annotated by Sheik and Tabitha Cicero. And this book here is probably one of the best introductions to the mainstream, or full complete explanations, I should say, of modern day ceremonial or high magic. It's not about like Wicca and things like that, like a lot of the stuff I've talked about on here. This one is way more intense, but it's not a grimoire. It doesn't show you how to do the metaphysics. It talks to you about why it's not what you might think it is, and that's the part that's so important. It's set up in a way to introduce you to like step 1 and take you to the end of like where most people end up if they go through the ceremonial route. And it talks about some of the important people that were involved in it, as well as different variations of within each section. Because when I say each section, we'll start here with the sections. It starts off going through the preliminaries, which are basically the way you set your foundation up. Like, you need to have this down before you start moving into the more complex things. So your first part is magic and yoga, and then it goes through a brief description, about 20 pages or so of that. And then in defense of the magical art, then there's a section on the Kabbalah, because that's in modern Western metaphysics and higher magic, the Kabbalah plays a massive role. Then it moves into astral light, which is astral travel, astral working, things like that. And then the man and the microcosm, and then you figure out more about the gods. Then it goes into the theories and the practices. And it goes through the tools and the correspondences, how to wake up your actual will, and then the vibrations of different names and words. She talks about scrying, and then different very specific grimoire types, which we'll talk about those here in a little bit. And then there's the discussion of group rituals and kind of how to get introduced to those. And then he ends it with kind of the various arguments with that section anyway, of theurgy, spiritualism, and black magic, because those are 3 very distinctively different things, and people today lump them all together. And that's, mind you, he wrote this in the 40s. And even then, they were lumping them all together. It's almost like there might be a theme here. Then we go into alchemy and prayers, hymns, and invocations. So you're starting the book off understanding more about what is actually magic. What does the term mean? And I'll usually reference it in my videos the way Crowley would, which is you'll add a K at the end to differentiate it from the illusionary sleight of hand. This is the actual spiritual pursuit that is done in a scientific and very logical manner. There will be a whole group of people out there that argue that that is not a true statement when it comes to the occult in general. But when you really get into the details of high magic or ceremonial magic, there's there's a lot of technicalities that go into that. And science is the art of asking questions. So before anyone wants to come at somebody about that, art of asking questions. You test a theory, then you propose upon it, and then you continue to test it. That's the art. That's the action. When we look at a lot of the higher stuff, we look at old grimoires and be like, well, back in 14th century, they did it this way. Does that work for you? Because if it doesn't, what about this other one? What about this other one? That's why we have the variations in different groups, is because they've tested their own theories and they've tried them. So that's kind of his argument in this first section. I won't say it's an apologetic book in the fact of its defending, but it does go through and explain how you have to develop a vision to practice. And when we're talking about this type of work, He does a very good job, Israel Regardie, of explaining what these various means are about the Holy Ghost, about the different church levels, because he was raised in a very religious environment, went to to his university, and studied for years and became quite the psychologist. He trained with Aleister Crowley for 2 years. He was his personal secretary, so he understands more about this practice than probably a lot of people of his day. And from his work, which I have read all but like 2 books of his, I will say the same. This man is second to really none for his knowledge, and he explains it in a way that breaks it down so it's easier for us to understand. Now, a lot of people, and I've had this argument in like IRL with people, will say, well, if he makes it too simple, then it takes away the power. No, it doesn't. Because the people who are going to understand it are going to understand it. The people who aren't, or are going to choose to call it something else, they're still going to call it that. So it doesn't really matter at that point. But he goes through how you come to the understanding of as above, so below, as within, so without, what it means to be a spiritual person. And this is the first part. And why, in a lot of ways, because again, he studied under Crowley, and Crowley's philosophy is if you can't master the physical body through practices like yoga, then you can't really master the mind or the spirit, because if you can't control this meat suit, what makes you think you're going to control anything more? And that's why he talks a lot about getting more into this understanding of how our bodies physically work and how to basically force them into compliance. And by doing so, you start to awaken a deeper side of yourself. And this is not an easy thing to do. We'll just put it that way. The other part that I like about this is they go through and they have a lot of illustrations. I just looked at one. I flipped the page too quick. That talk about like the mountain of initiation in theurgy. Theurgy is the art of divine magic. So you're using gods and god forms. But they have a lot of these wood print type paintings and sketches. There's several in here by Da Vinci, and then there's a whole list of others. But it's the way he goes about describing and talking about them that makes them interesting to me. Chapter 2, I will say this one here is actually a defense of mysticism and magic. And during the time when he did this, there is a group called Theosophy, headed by a woman named Madame Blavatsky. And I want to do a video on her, but I need to get a bit more information because I've read enough to have a cursory information. Personally, not impressed. And neither was Regardie. Neither was Crowley, if we're going to be truly honest. Because he talks in here about how they think of mysticism. Oh, it's just mediumship, and it's just this psychic thing. That means that you've never actually studied, you've never actually read, and you actually don't know what you're talking about. Mediumship is mediumship. It's a branch of spirituality. Psychicism and all the rest of that are side effects of a spiritual pursuit. Key term there. And so what he talks about through here is his defense of this, and how Blavatsky and her crowd of theosophists, and if you're a theosophist, that's fine, but I'm going by what he's talking about, they touch the surface level of a bottomless lake. And they see the surface level as, well, this is what it all is. Boy, is that not true. But how he goes through it is he describes how what they're talking about is really, they don't understand it. And they've never actually touched this information, because if they did, that philosophy that they propose would be thrown out immediately because it doesn't mean anything. The great work that you would push against Theosophists, according to him, is their term astral light is perceived as an exact reflection of yourself in several parts, qualities, and attributions, and then it's this self-reflection that leads to self-knowledge. That's their version, which is not always true. The definition of the astral light from the magical point of view is an exceedingly broad one, including all subtle planes above or within the physical. That's where the more high magic aspect of it comes in. And before you can really step into understanding the transcended knowledge, you have to understand the layers. You can't just go from ground level to the top floor without having the steps in between. And that's where a lot of he is talking in here about how they kind of have a blinded eye and they think they're very intelligent, and he actually is not being mean to them. He's really saying, don't overstep your knowledge. Don't overstep what you think you know. And this is one of the things that even in my studies of all this different work over the years has come to say, the minute you think you know something, you're going to find out you don't know anything at all. So if you start off with, I know nothing, and as you gain knowledge, you still know nothing, it keeps the door open so that you can expand further. That doesn't mean leave your mind open and have your brain fall out. It means keep a healthy respect for your knowledge that you carry, but understand that that is not the end all be all. You are I don't care if you studied for 70 years, you don't know everything about any branch of any of this mysticism. And that's what he's talking about with here, is how there's this arrogance that comes along with some of this some of these groups, where it just kind of blows up in their face. And then he talks, because S.L. McGregor Mathers and Westcott, when they helped develop the Golden Dawn, Woodman was the other one that was involved there, they studied and they researched and they built this off of a foundation that was kind of behind the scenes already there. And he said even with what they thought they knew, they would not exalt themselves above, I think it was the sixth degree for all three of them. They built the system. They put in place 10 degrees, but they only admitted themselves into level 6. Why? Because even they knew that they did not know enough about all of this to be able to actually step into those positions. And that's kind of his argument, is some of the most powerful people of the time would never have claimed that knowledge. And to me, that's pretty humbling in a lot of ways, but that's where he starts, and that's only the second chapter. But then you move into the Kabbalah, which there is a massive amount of information about there. So he kind of grazes across the top, giving a little bit of history, how it came to be, how the Jewish people adopted it, primarily from his research anyway, from Babylon and Egypt. Now there's probably a way older source to that, but for the time he wrote this is what he was talking about. And being annotated, there's little notes all through this whole book, and they talk like little footnote numbers, and you'll go and look those up, and it's because Sheik and Tabitha have went through and they've added further details. So Regardi wrote this back in the day, and these two are his direct disciples, you could say, and they've taken what he has taught them otherwise and then expanded beyond where he originally wrote it. So this original book wasn't as chunky as this one has become. And then he talks about, with the Kabbalah, the different sephiras, or sephirats, depending on who you talk to is how they say it, and the different deities that go with that, because each sephirat or sephira has a specific deity attached, and I'm probably not saying that according to some people, but I'm saying it according to phonetics that I learned. But they talk about like the tree of the sphere, the soul, and the tree of the spheres, which is this guy here. And this is a pretty old concept art. But he goes in and describes how the Kabbalah works, how it's been added into a lot of modern day mysticism and magic, how it breaks down between 4 different worlds, not 3, like a lot of people think, because you have the Atziluth, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. I'm probably saying those completely wrong, but that's all right. I don't speak full Yiddish. But he talks about how they're different areas because there's different concepts and mindsets with them. It's not as simple as, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do this one thing. No, you're not, because you're not going to understand it if you only go from one direction. And that's the beauty of how this book works, as far as I'm concerned. Again, we're not looking at it as a grimoire. That's not what it is. It is a base description and a way for you to understand ceremonial work in a much better way. So it's not, oh, well, I saw this thing on TV one time. Okay. Then we get into the section that is actually, I've went back to this particular set a lot, and the book's actually kind of broke the binding where this is because I've went here a lot. And this is describing the gods. In ceremonial, there is a high source of everything, depending on how you look at it. The unknowable name of God, which is the Jewish version, right there, that one. And then there's the deities that go down through the body and through the sephira of the tree of life. So, and he says, where are we at? The higher the magic has one of the objectives as a communion of both here and the hereafter with the divine, as a union not to be achieved by doctrine and sterile intellectual speculation, i.e., you need a personal relationship, but by the exercise of spiritual faculties and powers in rites and ceremonies, by the divine, the theurgist, which is God magic, practitioner, recognized an eternal spirituality and a dynamic principle that is refracted and manifested into beings who is consciousness, individualized, and severally are of lofty and sublime degree of spirituality, blah, 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 blah. He adds a lot of words. Basically, we want to take where we are at, move up into the realm of the angelic, into the level of the gods, and eventually touch the very source of all creation. The Gnostics would call that the monad by today's terms. But he's describing through here why a lot of people get into ceremonial work. Wicca is more of, and this is not a knock on anything, but your low magic is dealing with day-to-day life, money, love, romance, going after your neighbor for whatever, trying to do things here in the physical world. Ceremonial or high magic, which is what he was practicing through his life, through Golden Dawn and multitude of other work, was for a connection to source directly, which takes you outside of your physical form, and it's not something that you're just going to walk into simply. And that's why I feel this book is so important, because he goes through the different sephiras, and then which, if there's a planet associated, the gods of history that were associated, let's say Malkuth, which is the bottom, it's Earth. There's no planet, but because you're standing on it. The god is Seb, which is a Egyptian god, I believe. And then your archangel is Zaziel, and there's another angel that's associated. I don't remember off the top of my head. The choir is Ishim, but there's no intelligent of the planet because you're standing on it. And then there's no spirit of the planet because, again, you're standing on it. Malkuth is the material world in totality. So it's not like you're going to have, like you are the intelligence if you're going to go there. But then you can work all the way up into Kether. There's no planet associated with Kether because it's pure light and pure energy. The god would be Ptah in Egyptian, or Amun. And then you also have the archangel Metatron, who's very powerful in that one. The choir is the Keoth HaKadesh, which is, there's a different term for it. I just lost the words. I should have written that down. There's another choir that's associated with Kether. Because you're at your highest point, there's no intelligence because it's pure mind. It's pure spirit at that point. And that is an extremely powerful way of existing. And then you get into your magical correspondences. So you're building a platforms. You're starting off with what your foundation is, the arguments for and against. Obviously, he's for. Then you're understanding the reasons for what you're doing, the theurgy behind it, getting into the different god forms, the Kabbalah, things like that. Then in chapter 7, and I love this particular painting. If I could ever get this like on a wall print size, I would have it, because it's an alchemist in his laboratory. But you notice there's the meditation corner, there's the laboratory here, and then over here there's like a study and a place to research, and in the back you can see there's like another room that has a bed, and there's there's a lot of interest in that picture, and I've always found that one fascinating to meditate upon. But you're going through the correspondence and tools with the trappings, I guess you could call it, of ceremonialism. Each tool that you use has a very distinct and specific purpose. Over time, you actually can transform your body into the power source behind the tool, so you don't need the tools as much. But that takes years of practice. But it talks about even in the breastplate of the Hebrew priests through the book of Leviticus, talking about the uniforms. So this is not new concept, to have very specific regalia and very specific clothing. And as he talks about in here, magical ritual is a mnemonic process and arranged to result in the deliberate exhilaration of the will and the exultant of the imagination, the end being the purification of the personality and the attendant of a spiritual state of consciousness. The ego enters into a union with either the higher self or with God himself. By each act, word, and thought, this one object and if any particular ceremony is constantly being indicate to its unique purpose. You're not doing this for a simple purpose. You're not doing this for a simple thing. You're literally saying, I am going to elevate my mind and spirit to the highest possible aspect, using my will to drive the power of creation forward. And by doing so, you enter into a union with your higher self, which is thrown around a lot, and I talk about it on here. But when you really truly start to activate that higher frequency, things change. But you're working towards that union, and once you attain that, the next step is uniting with God, and that's the ascension, that is enlightenment, that is achieving the Buddha. If you look to the Eastern mysticisms, you're going beyond this meat suit. You're stepping into a different world altogether. That's really the intention behind the ceremonial workings. Is it's not to gain mastery over the world, because when you step into that higher realm, you realize that you are master, but you're also the servant, and that's the part that's so tricky. The ego doesn't have a place. The ego has to be dissolved into this higher frequency, which takes it away of all of its power, because you're stepping into the power of will. The ego can't exist in the current state of dominion when the will is dominant. When the will is dominant, the ego becomes a footstool, and that's what is required. And in chapter 8, he goes through the training of the will, and this is the capital W will. I say that a lot too. Because if you look at it from the capital state, this is the divine aspect, the spark of creation that you carry. This is that will being manifest into the physical world. It's not willpower to not eat that second donut. That's important, but that's lower capital W, or lowercase w. Capital W will is divine. This is where you can step into the role of commanding spiritual forces, and that is not something you're just going to walk in and do. And he talks a little bit about that. He talks about Eliphas Levi in his books on Transcendental Magic. He talks about the yogas and some of the meditation phrases that go along with it. I completely lost the word for it. But he talks about how Levi, in a lot of his work, would try to terrify people into not touching this. But there's a reason for that. And that reason is you don't give knowledge of this kind to the everyday person, especially not back in the day. When the not to be horrible here, but when the Catholic Church back in the 13th through the mid 1800s had so much power and sway, you didn't dare risk someone knowing that you knew this stuff because if you did, things could go bad pretty quick. So that's why you had to be very careful. And when Levi would talk about it, it wasn't from a state of, ooh, fear, I don't know. It was from a place of severe wisdom being couched in fear, so that you wouldn't go exploring it. The people who were brave enough would, because they weren't afraid of the consequences in the physical world if they were searching that level of sacred. So that's where we're at with that section. And he talks, the training of the will is a pretty big section, and mind you, this is not an exercise book. There are a couple of exercises in here, but the purpose of this text is to show you that what you may have thought is not always true. They go into the actions and the vibration of God names and words of power, which is a completely different way of calling forth these divine energies. He talks about scrying and astral travel, not as... And I have to say this because this is how I feel. The astral realm is a highway. You're not going there to hang out. That's weird. Why would you be playing in the middle of the flipping freeway? That is a pathway. You click in, you zip over it, you drop down, or you drop up, whatever. It is a place of travel. You do not live there. You do not hang out there. From practice, that's not what you do. And that's what he's talking about, is what does it mean to access that? When you start working with this, scrying is a visual interpretation or visual experience, like you're gazing into a crystal ball, or you're gazing into a pool of water, like a moon reflection on a lake is a great way to scry. But then he talks about astral travel and what the purpose of it is. It is not what modern day, a lot of modern day occultists do, because they have a misunderstanding, and I don't knock them for that. It's just they've not read into it or practiced enough to know that that's not what you're doing. You're not going there to do anything other than travel. That's the purpose. It's a highway, and then get out of it. I like the fact that in this edition, and the newer ones even have this as well, there's a section in the middle of color plates, so you can see like the different meditations, I just lost it, symbols that you can use from some of the Hindu practices. There's a section here on the hexagram of Solomon, which is the tetragrammaton. Then you get into the assumption of God forms. This is not possession. The assuming of God forms is in a very, very complex action that is only to be undertaken once you have achieved understanding, not mastery, understanding of the capital W, the divine will. Then the God forms can become in, and he talks about the risks with that. It is not something like, I'm just going to go out and I'm going to summon forth. You're going to regret that if you don't know what you're doing. Chapter 12, it gets into, according to Crowley, the most powerful working and the most important working you will ever do in your existence, which is the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage. There's a whole 25 or 30 pages on just that, and that is a very strict text. The one that he did his work on was the one by S.L. McGregor Mathers, which was actually the flawed version that was published in Mathers published it in 1912 or 1915, something like that. But he had the French version, which was the actual flawed version. There was a lot of stuff missing, and he filled in blanks on a lot of things. Still powerful, but then there's more that has come out since then about that ritual, and it's way more intense than what they thought, but also more user-friendly. Then we get into a section on the grimoires, which is, when I first picked up this book, that was kind of my curiosity, but by the end of this chapter, the curiosity was changed into a bit more respect for the art, because it is not, again, we're not looking at this from a frivolous place. This is a very serious action that you are taking when you do this, and it changes not just you, but it can change the world around you. And there he talks about the different tools that you need for protection and the symbols that go along with it. He gives some vague references to the spirits that have been called through certain arts, but he also gives the heads up that this is not something you want to do until you've achieved certain other details, because the risks are too high. And matter of fact, I had this conversation recently in my personal life about these kind of things. We were discussing spirituality and things like that, and it really comes down to, and he talks about it in here, there are certain things that are easy to do but extremely dangerous. If you don't add the complex layers in the middle, basically it's protection and preparation, things can go really bad really fast. So you want to make sure you're doing things accordingly, and that's what he's talking about in here. With the initiation and group rituals, and I do feel that that's an important part, if you're in a situation where you can get with a good organization, and I'm very specific intentional when I say good, you want a group, if you're going with like the Golden Dawn, you want a group that came directly from the original source, meaning they have ties to Israel Regardie, to the Ciceros, things like that, because those groups are the most clean line back to Woodman, Westcott, and Mathers. There are, in my research, there's about 6 or 7 different groups. There's literally one that is actually a straight line. The rest of them have added all these different layers and these different grade sections. There's one out there, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, that talks about having a 33rd degree. Okay, you leave your masonry, modern day masonry, out of this. That Golden Dawn is not that. There are some aspects that are similar, but don't go confusing the two. That's just obnoxious. Then he gets into this chapter 15, which honestly, if you want to start with a section of it just to kind of get an idea of what he's talking about through the rest of it, 15 is a good place to start. And it's the reason I say that, theurgy, God magic, versus spiritualism, which is just working with spirits, and black magic, working specifically with demons for negative arts. And he goes through this entire section here talking about it. The theoretical relationship which modern spiritualism occupies in connection with magic is bound at some time or the other to be questioned. Consequently, it also answers must be provided. A brief discussion of this matter will be entered upon here, as it does not seem the writer to be of particular importance. He doesn't think it's that important. I have other opinions because of of the past 100 years from when he wrote it. Where I had this noted in my bookmark fell out. Everything comes down to the force of will, and that is the key term with that. Is if you cannot work with spiritual will, spiritualism is where you're going to end up. It's just what it is, because will is command over that, and that's where you have to be in that divine alignment, because it's not command in the way of I will smite thee with a stick. It's more of command of, because God's source is with me, you will do this. And it is a different power dynamic there. And then he talks about evocation versus invocation, what kind of the practices that go along with it, and what the difference is between the theurgy aspect, working with God forms, versus the demonic, working strictly with spirits and necromancy and black magic and things like that. So it is an entirely, to me, that's this 15th chapter is probably one of the most important chapters in this entire book. The book is great by itself. After you get done with that one, it goes into alchemy, which is a very interesting art and science, which is where we get the modern day chemistry. They'll argue about this for years. You go back to the source material, which is about 2,200 years ago. Alchemy was the completion of science and mysticism in one. That is actually provable. So understanding alchemy can change the dynamic altogether, and alchemy is a very, very strong part of theurgy, of high ceremonial workings. If you don't have alchemy, you don't have to do alchemy to do this, but it's best if you do alchemy, because it's helping you develop this thing, this physical meat suit, into something higher. And it also helps refine the spirit, because you have a physical interpretation that is showing where your spirit level is at, which is kind of fun. Then the final section, and I'll wrap this video up, is a section on prayers, hymns, and invocations. He goes through and has quite a few different hymns to different planets. There's one in here for the sun. There are invocations to different deities, generic ones, not major stuff. And then there's different ways to pray and how you should understand what prayer is. And weirdly enough, in 400 or so pages, he never references one of the more powerful tools that the Golden Dawn uses, which is Enochian magic. Not something you want to play with unless you're at least aware of it and understand, again, divine will. But he brings it in with the prayer aspect, because Enochian is, in my opinion, and I can't remember how he phrases it in here, but it is probably the apex of theurgy. It is the highest form of this type of work. The rituals are extremely complex. The letters, it's an entirely separate language. It's actually still being studied today, because where did this language come from and how does it work? It actually is a literal language. So it's very complex, but that's why he references it in this section, because it's a way to kind of wrap up this type of practice. And then at the end of it, they've added in, Sheik and Tabitha have added in a whole bunch of illustration notes and other sources of research to look into. There's a whole big glossary defining a lot of the words and the people, because Regardie did a great work when he did this book. This is a primer introduction to all forms of ceremonial mysticism and magic, but he did it in a way as to say, this is, strip away all the nonsense. This is what you're doing. This is what these practices are. If you choose to go into it, you're not going to go into it blindly if you went through this book. It is a tome and a half. It's gigantic. Total with everything, it's like 500 and some pages. And like I said, it's a good sized book. I'll have a link in the description. You can check it out. If you've ever read this book, I would be interested to hear your thoughts on it. I know the first time I read it, many moons ago, it was very transformative because it opened my eyes to an entirely different world, but also gave me a foundation to understand it without the frivolity and without the fear attached to it. There's a healthy dose of respect in this book, but it takes away all the nonsense. So, but yeah, let me know in the comments down below if you've ever read this book. While you're down there, hit that like button, subscribe, all the fun streamer stuff. But the other part, I'm just curious, if you have read it, what are your opinions? Because I am curious to hear others' thoughts. So, have a great rest of your day. I'll see you in the next video.